Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our Let's Talk About Grief and Bereavement session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Connolly, and I'm the Community Relations and Engagement Coordinator here at Seniors NL. Sign language interpretation for our Let's Talk About sessions are supported by the Disability Policy Office, Department of Seniors, Youth, and Social Development, to whom we are very grateful. Before I go ahead and introduce our presenters today, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping tips. Please mute to block out any outside noise. The closed captioning button is on the bottom of the screen. Please place your questions and comments in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. This session is also being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube channel for viewing later on. And if you do have any presentation requests, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll take a few moments to acknowledge the land we live on.
Good morning. We respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Bereavement, whose culture has now been erased forever. We also acknowledge the island of Utahunguk as the unceded traditional territory of the Bereavement and the Mi'kmaq. And we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu, of Tassanen, and the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all.
Thank you so much, Barb.
You're welcome.
At the end of the presentation, we'll also be opening up the mics for your questions and your comments. I'd like to introduce our special guest speakers now from NL Health Services. Jenna has been a manager with Pastoral Care and Bereavement Services in the Eastern Zone for 5 years. Her specialty is in complex bereavement as well as spiritual care. Jenna is responsible for coordinating spiritual care in mental health and addiction programs, as well as overseeing education initiatives for grief, bereavement, and spiritual health. Vanessa is a registered nurse with the Labrador Grenfell Zone. She is a palliative care coordinator for both inpatient and the community. Sandra has been a manager of spiritual health in the Western Zone for 14 years and has over 20 years experience working in grief and bereavement. She spends half her day working in palliative care unit in Corner Brook, and the remainder of her day overseeing the regional spiritual health program. Shannon is a social worker with the palliative and end-of-life care team in Central Zone. She works as a grief and bereavement consultant for her region. She also provides social work services for the palliative and end-of-life team. When she isn't working, you could probably find her in the kitchen cooking. Shannon also enjoys community leadership. She is a proud Rotarian and also volunteers with her community groups in Gander, where she lives with her husband and her daughter. And Jenna, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then the floor is yours to share and start our presentation.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Here we go. Okay, wonderful. So part of the objectives of today's conversation is to explore the topic of grief, loss, and bereavement. And hopefully as we go along, a lot of the questions that you folks have submitted, hopefully they'll be answered. I will say in the short hour that we have, or hour and a half, it's really going to be difficult to speak to everybody's unique situation. But part of this presentation is to be able to hopefully assist you in understanding where you are in the grieving process. So a couple of the main concepts that we explore is the fact that, loss is universal. Grief is a normal human experience that all of us have to go through at some point in our life. And we all bring our own unique personalities, experiences, circumstances to grief and to bereavement. And so as we explore some of the theories around grief and bereavement, as we explore some of the research together, hopefully that might highlight to you where you are in your own unique journey. And then hopefully, provide you with some of the resources, some of the tools, the services offered in your region to empower you in your journey. Because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about how the grief process works. And one of the things I always say to people is that there's really, I can't tell you the right or wrong way to grieve. Our role as grief educators is to say, okay, are you grieving in a healthy way? Or are some of the things that you are doing hindering you in your grief? But there's no single formula. There's no single right way to grieve. A lot of people have ideas and misconceptions about how grief should go. A lot of people are afraid that somehow they're doing it wrong. So hopefully at the end of the presentation, you will have some tools and some understanding of where you are in your journey to empower you to move forward in a way that is right for you. So I think it might be helpful to start off with some definitions. And again, it will be difficult to speak to everyone's own unique situation here on the call, but we do want to recognize that there are types of grief that do not correlate with bereavement as such. But the focus of the presentation today is on loss due to death or loss due to bereavement. However, we do recognize that grief is associated with many types of losses. And even change. So grief sometimes can manifest itself in our lives or be an emotion that we experience, even when changes are positive. So some people may experience grief, if they leave a job to accept a new position, they're leaving their old job behind. The change is not necessarily negative. It's a change, a life stage change that happens, which brings about a lot of mixed emotions. If any of you on the call have raised children and you see them graduate high school or get married or start their own family, all of those things are really positive changes that happen in life, but also can bring a sense of grief because things are different and there is an adjustment. Other changes that happen in life where we might experience grief or loss, maybe you have to sell a home. Maybe you have to move to a different region of the province. Maybe you've experienced divorce. Maybe you've experienced a change in your health status. Maybe you've experienced a change in your personal abilities, whether that's cognitive abilities, physical abilities. all of those things bring with it a sense of mourning and a sense of grief. And so while today's presentation is focused on bereavement, some of the principles can certainly be translated into other types of grief as well. And so the terms grief, bereavement, and mourning are often used interchangeably. However, they do have different meanings. So grief is the normal process of reacting to a loss. So it can be in response to a physical loss, such as death, or a social loss, which includes, relationships, jobs, and some of the examples that I've already outlined. Bereavement is the period after a loss during which grief and mourning occurs. So often the period of bereavement is what directly follows the loss. So the time spent in bereavement for the loss often depends on the circumstances of the loss, and the level of attachment to the person that had died. So what was your relationship to the person that had died? We grieve differently depending on how close we were to the person in our life that has died. And then mourning is the process by which people adapt to the loss. And so it's a period where you're renegotiating life. You're working your way through all the change that has happened. And so the way that each of us mourns is greatly influenced by our upbringing, our own cultural beliefs, our own practices, the rituals in which we engage in during our period of mourning and bereavement. So again, all of these terms we tend to use interchangeably, but it's important to highlight some of the differences between them. So grief is a response to the loss of someone or something that was important to you. Bereavement is part of the mourning period. And so bereavement is usually used to refer to the fact of the loss, and is often used to, grief then is often used to describe the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral responses to the death. So when people talk about grief, they're talking about all the changes in maybe the ways that their cognitive abilities, their mental abilities, their emotions are affected by the loss. So as we start our presentation, we're going to start by watching this video from the Irish Hospice Foundation. And so this is a video, and if you're interested in learning more about grief, the Irish Hospice Foundation has lots of short little video clips on YouTube. And this is just a brief 4-minute video that gives an overview of understanding grief.
The Irish Hospice Foundation, IHF, is a national charity dedicated to all matters relating to dying, death and bereavement in Ireland. In this video we will look at understanding what grief is.
Grief is something that everyone will experience at some point in their life. Knowing how the grieving process works helps us understand our own grief and enables us to effectively support others who are grieving.
Loss is losing something that is of significance to us. Grief is the natural process of reaction and adjustment to loss and change. This can involve intense sorrow, which can be mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering resulting from loss.
I think all our lives are about loss. Yet the losses that really hurt, though, are the losses that seem to take from our lives. You know, we lose a job, we lose a loved one, we lose our hair, we lose our health. And in some ways they shatter our world, because what was predictable yesterday and familiar is gone today. And that takes a hell of an adjustment. And that adjustment, I suppose, is what we call grieving. Grieving is simply coming to terms with something you've lost that was really important to you.
Grief is not an illness, nor is it something that needs to be fixed. It's a normal part of life and living.
It's a very emotionally intense process. It takes a long time. Like even the most normal of bereavements, we're looking at probably 2 years roughly for a normal bereavement to follow through to a point where they can adapt. So it's a long process, so you need to be prepared for the time element as well.
Grief can affect all aspects of our lives. It is not something that we can take up or put down as we choose. It has its own rhythm which will demand our attention from time to time. It is important to remember that we will have good days and bad days. We need to be able to spend time dealing with our loss and time away from it, doing other things. All this is part of the normal process of coping with loss. You must also remember that people grieve in different ways. Some people like to share their grief and talk about it, whilst others are more private and prefer to channel their grief into activities. In summary, grief is the natural process of reaction and adjustment to loss and change. It is not an illness. It is not something to be fixed. Grieving is about learning to live with the losses in our lives. It normally takes people a minimum of 2 years to adjust to the major aspects of bereavement. And remember, people grieve in different ways.
Everybody will experience loss. Each one of us will experience loss. It is a fundamental part of being alive. Everybody has to grieve. It's simply, we either grieve or we close ourselves off and we become hard or numb and we stop feeling. Because if you're going to keep your heart open, it is going to be broken over and over again. And yet, as you grieve, it will heal. And as it heals, it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what it's all about.
So grief. Grief is the pain that heals itself. And one of the things you'll probably hear us say over and over again is that it's normal, natural, and healthy. And so a lot of people wonder, well, if this is true, if this is normal, if this is natural, if this is actually healthy for me, why then am I feeling so distressed? It is healthy. It's our body's natural way of healing itself after a loss. But it's not comfortable. It's not a comfortable emotion to feel. It's not a comfortable process to go through. When we are grieving, we have experienced such change and loss that it really is a huge shift in the way that we live our lives. Likely the person that you are missing was a huge part of your life. And so they continue to be with you wherever you go. Our brains, our bodies are learning how to adjust. And so in the video, I always like to highlight this because in the video, it talks about taking 2 years to adjust to the major aspects of bereavement. And so that term is really important. The misconception is people say, okay, in 2 years, I can be done grieving. That's not true. What they're referring to is because there is so much change due to bereavement, normally it can take, up to 2 years to adjust to all the changes that have occurred in our life because of the death of a loved one. So that doesn't mean that after a certain timeline, after a certain period of time, that your grief just goes away. When you have experienced loss, your grief grows and changes as you grow and change. And so the way that we experience our grief immediately after the loss is different than the way that we experience our grief in 2 years after our loss. Grief is not something that just goes away. Grief is something that we kind of have to learn to accept and live with. Will it always be significantly painful? Hopefully not. The goal is for us to learn how to manage our grief and work through our grief so that it doesn't overtake our life, and that we can work through it in a healthy way. So grief is not a disorder. It's not a disease. It's not a sign of weakness. Grief is the emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price that we pay for love. And so the only cure for grief is actually to allow yourself to grieve, and know that it's okay to grieve. And this is what our bodies and brains are supposed to do after we experience a loss. So again, grief is a normal reaction to having something unwanted happen in one's life. Grief is a normal reaction to change. Grief is a continuing development involving many changes. Some changes are very obvious. Well, when I come home at the end of the day, my loved one is not there. When I go to sleep at night, they may not be in the bed next to me. Some changes are really unexpected. You may be reminded of your loved one in simple ways. And so this is one of the things that can be a little upsetting. If you're used to having, someone around the house who's the fixer, who's doing the little repairs, having a sink that's not working can trigger a feeling of grief, because you would normally turn to that person to fix the sink and you wouldn't even have to think about it. Sometimes the changes involve changes in who we are that we may not have expected. Maybe our role in the family has changed now. Maybe we were a caregiver to the person who has died. And now that we are no longer a caregiver, who are we? What do we like to do? What do we do for ourselves? How do we go about our day-to-day activities without this other person physically here? Grief is also affected by what we expect. So if we expect grief to occur in a very linear fashion, we may be upset when we feel like our emotions are all over the place and we can't make sense of things. Grief, again, there is no timeline, there is no formula. And so preparing yourself for the ups and downs of grief, knowing that there is no formula, may be a helpful mindset to adapt. Grief is hard work. Grief is an expenditure of emotional and physical energy. So you will be tired. You will feel exhausted. At the end of the day, you may not feel like you've really done much, but really your brain is working very hard to work itself through this loss. So chances are you will be tired. It's a total and universal experience. So again, everyone on this call, I can guarantee, has experienced grief in one shape or form. And it affects every part of who we are. It affects our biology, it affects our psychology, it affects our social life, it affects our spiritual life. And again, grief is a process that is unique to each individual and changes with the passing of time. As we change and grow and adapt, so does our grief. On this next slide, we'll talk about some of the normal grief reactions, and people tend to find this helpful because it answers a lot of the questions about the unique things that they are experiencing internally that they might not always have the words to explain. And when they see this chart of the different ways that grief can affect us, they were like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I did not know that was normal. So for example, some of the emotional reactions, anxiety and fear. When we've experienced change, when we've experienced loss, when we've experienced death, anxiety and fear are normal. Having someone in our life that has died often causes us to think about our own death. It causes us to think about circumstances of death. You might find yourself preoccupied about the death. You might find that you have anxiety about your own future, or anxiety about other people in your life dying. Fears about what happens to people when they die. Fears about what happens after death. Where do people go? But that is because death and loss are very forefront in our minds, and we're trying to make sense of it. So again, is to try and work with your anxiety so it doesn't become distressing, but know that a certain amount of anxiety and fear and questioning are quite normal. It's also really common to experience a lot of shock and numbness, especially in the weeks immediately after the death. So a lot of people in grief support groups, a lot of people I talk to in grief counseling ask, I was at the funeral and I don't remember who was there. I feel like there's something wrong with me, like what happened to me. But it's because your body sometimes is in such shock that in order to protect itself from becoming overwhelmed, we just might feel kind of numb to the things that are going on around us, feeling like we're just going through the motions. We're in survival mode. Anger is a really common emotion. You may be angry at your loved one for leaving you. You might be angry at them for the way that they died. You may be angry because maybe they were keeping a secret how unwell they actually were. Maybe you're angry at a family member who you didn't feel supported you enough through this loss. Maybe you're angry at the healthcare team who you think, should have recognized what was going on. So there's lots and lots of ways that we experience anger after death and loss. And that's normal. It's important to let that anger out, not in a way that it's harmful to yourself or another person, but be able to give voice to those feelings that sometimes we have to feel that we have to suppress. Guilt and blame. People do themselves a lot of harm by taking on unhealthy guilt and blame. Healthy guilt is a good thing, and it helps us kind of correct behaviors that go against our own values. However, unhealthy guilt happens when we think we are responsible for something that we could not control. When death happens, we did not cause it, and we cannot control it. So it's a form of self-punishment when we kind of renegotiate all the things that could have happened or should have happened, or what if I did this, or what if I acted differently in this situation. Most people do the best that they can with the information that they have at the time. So although grief and guilt are emotions that are strongly tied together, it would be helpful for you to work through some of those feelings of guilt, maybe with a support person in your life. And of course, sadness and hurt. You're going to be sad. So it's a way to say, to try and teach yourself, okay, this sadness and this hurt is normal. I won't feel this intense sadness forever, but I do have to feel it for a period of time as I learn to adjust to this loss. Some mental things that we might experience: disbelief, right? So a common thing could be, I walk in the house and I expect to see my loved one in their favorite chair. Or I go to visit my relative and I expect to walk in the door and they'll be there. Or something good happens and I want to pick up the phone and call them. So we're so used to having that person in our lives, it actually takes a little while for the reality of it to sink in. And you might be confused by all that. You might be experiencing things that you just have no idea why you're experiencing them. We talked a little bit about being preoccupied, preoccupied by the death, ruminating around the circumstances of the death, ruminating around your current circumstances and the future. Our minds might be in a totally different place. You might be even experiencing that today. You might be here, but your mind might be elsewhere. One of the things that people are often not aware of is the idea of poor concentration and forgetfulness. So people say to me, I go back to work and I can't focus. I always got good reviews at my job, but now I can't concentrate long enough to write an email. I went to the grocery store and I completely forgot why I was there. I got up this morning when I went about my day and I even forgot to take a shower. So, you know, even some of the things where we normally would be quite organized and put together, we now find it hard to kind of go about our day without making a lot of notes and lists and having a calendar to rely on. The physical symptoms, a lot of the physical symptoms mimic a type of anxiety, and it really is a stress reaction, right? So if we think of other times in our life where we've experienced a big change or a big stressor, you know, we have upset stomach, digestive issues, tight chest, feeling like we can't really, you know, breathe, we have lack of energy, we can be agitated, we're sensitive to noise, we're sensitive to light, we might not be able to go to public places because we're feeling overwhelmed. Some people even experience dizziness or weakness because their body is going through a physical reaction. And along with that, it's really common for people to experience disturbances in sleep, appetite changes, and feeling the need to withdraw and be alone. And while some of those things are okay and are normal, it's really important to pay attention to those things. And so when we go through such a stressful circumstance, we have to take care of our physical bodies. So maintaining a routine, trying to go to bed at the same time every night, trying to carry out your day as normal as you possibly can, making sure you're eating, making sure you're not isolating yourself. Those are really, really basic, important things. And if you do nothing else, with your stressful circumstance or your grief, making sure that you take care of your physical body will allow you to deal with some of these other mental and emotional reactions that you experience. So this, I think, is an important visual because we talked about earlier that grief is affected by what we expect. So I will tell you that this slide right here is a myth. I'll tell you that up front. But this is generally how most people conceptualize change in their life. That at the beginning is when you experience the most amount of grief. Your loved one has died in the first couple of weeks. You are feeling the absolute worst, and that over time is kind of like the flu, right? The first day you get the flu, it kind of knocks you out, and over time you get better and better and better and better until eventually you don't have the flu anymore. However, a more healthy way to think about grief and a more realistic way to think about grief is that grief comes in waves. So like I said earlier, a lot of times the funeral may not necessarily be the most difficult point of grief. You may be feeling so numb at that point, you don't even know what you're feeling. And then, a few days go by and you think that you're adjusting, and then all of a sudden something happens and grief kind of overtakes you again. And then along the way, grief kind of comes and goes. It's a little unpredictable. the trend should be that over time, as you can see, that there will be more good days than bad, and then the waves won't be as high, they won't peak as much, the grief won't be as powerful. But you'll generally tend to experience waves of grief throughout your journey. Waves of grief are really common. You might experience a wave of grief if you hear a song on the radio that reminds you of a loved one. Christmas is a time when people often feel waves of grief. Birthdays, anniversaries, going to special places, eating out at a favorite restaurant that reminds you of your loved one. All of those times are common times when people experience waves. But again, generally over time, the waves will become less powerful as you learn to manage them along the way. I also think this is a really important reminder. And that reminder is, when you remind yourself that grief comes in waves, don't forget to remind yourself that happiness also comes in waves. And so one of the things that can be difficult as we experience grief is we want to have better days. That is the goal of most people who attend support groups, attend counseling, attend education sessions. It's like, I want to feel better. But then sometimes when we feel better and we have a good day, we beat ourselves up and say, oh my goodness, I'm feeling better. Does that mean I don't care about my loved one anymore? Does that mean I've forgotten them? Does that mean, I should be grieving still? I should, maybe I should be crying. What's wrong with me? Why aren't I in distress? We need positive experiences in our lives to counteract the stressful, negative experiences. So if you are having a good day, if you are having a moment of peace, if you are having a moment of happiness or laughter or joy, do not self-sabotage yourself by making yourself feel guilty. It's important to have those positive experiences to get you through the difficult emotions of grief. The grief will come and go, and the happiness will come and go. And we need all of those emotions working together. And you might even find that you experience them all at the same time, and that's okay. The goal is to do well, to be healthy. And if you are finding that you are moving through your grief in a healthy way, don't beat yourself up for that. You deserve to grieve in a healthy way. So again, before I pass this over to my colleague, Shannon, how we want grief to work. I wish I could be here today and say, okay, here is step 1, step 2, step 3. And then you complete these 3 steps and you're done grieving. That's not how it works. Grief often feels like this tangled ball of wool here, this tangled mess of emotion, this tangled mess of thoughts. And somehow we need to find the words and ways to work ourselves through this. And then eventually we kind of come out the other side. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand this over now to my colleague, Shannon.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second and I will bring my screen up. Hopefully that happens seamlessly. Thank you, Jenna. It's always nice to listen to our colleagues in their presentations as well, just because we all have different ways of explaining things and different examples that we like to use. So it's nice to listen to that. Is my screen showing okay there for everybody now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I'm just going to jump right in here just by speaking a little bit about this quote. So It reads, when the one you share your life with dies, they die in a million different places, in a million different ways. They aren't just missing from the life you had, they're missing from all the life that is yet to come. And that is such a good quote to really express that intricate way that, grief shows up in so many ways of your life. Like Jenna had mentioned, it shows up so much in so many dynamic ways. It's showing up when you're at the grocery store, when you reach for that thing that your loved one liked to eat. It shows up when there's a question that you normally would have asked your loved one and you can't because they're not here. There's just so many reminders throughout your life and your days when you experience that loss. And I find that for a lot of people, it's just that fact that, like the quote mentions, it's what was yet to come, and that you didn't see that part of your life, or you didn't see those plans in a way that they weren't there. So, I think that this is a really nice quote that really speaks to that. And when we talk about the dynamic and intricate things that happen with grief, I think that, we really have to consider that in detail. And, it affects our personalities. Like, I often will hear people say, I'm not the same person anymore. Like, I don't feel the same in a room anymore. Like, when I'm in a group of people, the person I am now is different than the person I used to be, because going through and moving through the grief journey can really change like who we are as people, and how we show up, and what kind of characteristics we have when we put ourselves in different situations. Our environment as well, that really influences our grief. And so it's not only the way that grief impacts these areas, but it's also that what we bring to our grief as people is, what makes this so different in everybody. So the type of personality that you have going into your loss can really affect like how your grief influences you, your environment. So for example, and I know that Jenna mentioned as well, like how important it is to really try to not isolate yourself when you're going through the pain of grief. I often talk to people who, if we can work a little bit on being less isolated and making that environmental change to what your experience is on a daily basis, that can really make a difference in the healthiness of your grief as well. The nature of the loss is such a big piece of what grief looks like for everybody. Every story of the loss, that comes from every different person is so different. Some people have traumatic losses. Some people have losses after lengthy times of caregiving that have already had such an impact on a person's health and mental health. And then they experience the grief after that caregiving journey. And that can really, bring a lot of factors in, because we see people then, and they have oftentimes exhaustion from all their caregiving. So the nature of the loss, right, is really a big piece of that. Other losses. So often we talk to people as well who've experienced multiple losses in their life.
Shannon, can I just interrupt there? My apologies.
Sure.
By any chance, did you change your screen? Because we're not seeing anything on our side.
Oh, no, I didn't touch anything, and it looks exactly the same for me, but let me see.
Catherine, Sherry here. I can see her screen.
Oh,
Okay. All right. Thank you.
can you see it now?
Yeah, everything is normal.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. My apologies there.
Thanks for jumping in to let me know, because if there is an issue, I'd much rather know when it's happening than afterwards.
No,
So
you're all good.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Other losses. So for example, oftentimes when people, have experienced other losses, it may even put them more at risk to have, a certain amount of difficulty with their most current loss. To make that example a little clearer, we say if we're working with individuals who are perhaps elderly and they experienced a loss earlier in their life. Maybe they lost, for example, a child early in their life, and then they experience another loss later in their life. That will put them at risk to experience, a lot more difficulty in their loss because they bring with them that other loss throughout their life. Um, and the significance of the loss to us is also a really important factor because oftentimes we see people in situations where this is the classic story that I hear so often of, say, two people, are living together throughout their life. They're partners. They share, what they do on a day-to-day basis. One is maybe got a strength in one area and one in another, or maybe one of them does a lot of the caregiving and then the other is not able to do as much of the care. And so when the person who does a lot of caregiving dies, then of course that's a significant loss in that person's life because it's really changed their life. And now their care is going to suffer because the person who was doing more caregiving is now lost. And it's just a little example to put that into context, but there's lots of different ways, that it is significant in your own life. Obviously, if you're younger and you lose your partner, then, maybe that partner was responsible for a lot of childcare in your life, and that's a huge change for you and changes your responsibilities in your home and how you manage that. So, the significance is big. And oftentimes when people lose somebody such as a partner or a best friend or, a brother or a sister, maybe that person is someone you just spoke to so much and relied on them a lot, and it really changes how you think about things in your life. Another slide here, again, just really speaking to the intricate, use that word again, but the intricate ways that grief shows up. So there's also secondary losses, and I kind of used that a little bit in the previous examples. But we talk about the person we love, the person we miss, but there's also the ways that it affects life sometimes in a secondary, practical sense, maybe. A loss of income can be very stressful, of course. A loss of support system, like I mentioned, that person that you call, that person who helps you with decisions. A loss of dreams for the future, things that you thought would happen together, especially with people who I've experienced, so many stories that I've heard from people that I've worked with about that, right? In terms of like people who have lost even a child, like, or even pregnancy loss. That's a big loss in terms of the hopes and dreams for the future. So the loss of an identity. So, you know, um, this can show up in a lot of different ways. It can show up as the loss of identity in terms of you maybe in a partner and how that was, or maybe you as a mother or you as a father. That can change. But then oftentimes people take on this new identity because they're the grieving person, and it wasn't an identity that they ever wanted to have in their life. They didn't choose that, but now they feel that that's such a big part of their identity. That can be really challenging as well. People can experience a loss of faith as well. Sometimes, when you experience a loss, I spoke to someone just a couple of weeks ago and they were telling me how, they never really questioned things in their faith before and the faith that they choose to follow. But since experiencing a really significant loss in their life, they're just having trouble seeing that now because it's really challenged it. And, having a significant loss can just challenge the way that you see the world in general. And a loss of confidence, a loss of financial security. There's so many ways that experiencing a loss has, detailed ways of showing up, even in practical senses in our life as well. I'm going to take a moment now. Some of you may or may have not heard of Wardens Tasks of Mourning. This is a really common concept or theory that we draw upon oftentimes as grief counselors. So you may even make a note of that in terms of something you may want to look up in the future. But in Warden's work, he speaks to the fact that there are tasks of mourning. Um, and, these tasks don't happen in a sequential way, just like we talked about. The progression of grief is not like linear, it's up and down. People may experience these tasks in interchangeable ways throughout their life. So, he talks about the first task in terms of accepting the reality of the loss. And it just goes to speak to that piece of, the work that your brain has to do. Your brain having to know and understand that that person's not here. Just that simple concept can be so much for your brain to get around in terms of accepting the reality of loss. The experience of the pain of the loss, like Jenna mentioned, the goal in grief is that you experience it healthy, and that although it's painful, it is meant to be painful and it's meant to hurt. That's part of the journey. No one wishes for it to be that way, but it's just the nature of the experience. Task 3 speaks to adjusting to living without the person. So just going back to that previous slide I talked about, if you think about all the ways that it practically shows up, how do you live your life now? How does that look, right? If you're now, if you've lost your partner and now you're single, like how do you adjust to living that life now, and what that looks like for you? And task 4 speaks a bit to find an enduring connection and start again. So, oftentimes we speak about just that relationship with the person on a spiritual sense. Now that you're moving forward at times in your life, you still have that connection to them, but you are starting again and searching for a new normal at the same time, while still having that connection to the person you love so much. And a nice little quote here about acceptance is not about liking the situation. It's about acknowledging all that has been lost and learning to live with that loss. It's just how do you move through, while acknowledging that you're hurting and maybe experiencing in your new normal little bits, like Jenna said, it's okay to have waves of happiness as well while you're learning and adjusting. So a person who's able to have hope for the future, and continue to build new relationships and settles into new patterns of life is generally accepted as having completed these 4 tasks. So just something to keep in mind. There's many different theories that we draw upon in grief work, but this is just one. Warden's tasks are very common, and you may choose to learn more about that or not. Another quote here from Helen Keller: what we once enjoyed and deeply loved, we can never lose, for all that we love deeply becomes a part of us. And I'd speak again to that connection. So how does that loved one that you lost still live in your life? What are the ways that you see them? Do you see them in nature? Do you feel a connection to them when you're in a place that they loved, right? How does it affect you as you move forward in terms of keeping that connection? So I think that that's a nice quote to speak to that as well. And as I started to mention, there's change and new beginnings. And so we often refer to this in grief work as the new normal as well. And that's because grief involves a lot of changes, including changes within your own self. And it involves accepting that you'll be different now, than what you were before. And the life ahead of you is going to be different as well. You don't get over it, you get through it. And I hear I hear people tell me that all the time, the people that we work with. You don't get by it because you can't get around it. It doesn't get better, it just gets different. Every day, grief puts on a new face. And that's a nice quote as well. And I think that one of the ways I like to demonstrate that same point to people is I always say, now I'm going to warn you, you can't be up to it. So just as you think you have this all figured out, I want you to think of these words when something really surprising happens and maybe it brings you right back and knocks you off your feet with your grief. I want you to remember that, it'll show up in new ways, and sometimes you can predict it and sometimes you can't. My little screen here is covering what I want to say here. So what helps as you're going through this journey? Getting to know yourself. And that's what I always really like to talk to people about in counseling as well, is that there's the things we know about grief, but let's get to know what yours looks like. Getting to know your grief, getting to know how you cope with things, and a better understanding of the process of grief and some of these things that we've talked about today hopefully will help normalize some of the things that you experience in your grief. A nice little diagram here as well. Just to speak to, it's nice to have visuals because there's so many things about grief that are hard to put into words. But about growing around grief as well. People think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. But in reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. So just something to think about as well, in the experience of grief. I'm cognizant of time, but the value of funerals, memorials, rituals, and anniversaries. So just to speak to this for a moment, people now I find more than ever, they choose sometimes to and not to have different sorts of rituals. I think we have seen some changes in the post-pandemic world because it opened our eyes to different ways to experience loss and rituals. These things sometimes for people make the loss very real. It can be an opportunity to express thoughts and feelings about the person who you've lost. It can be a beautiful time for reflection on people's lives. And oftentimes, you'll hear people refer to this as a celebration of life, for example. And it can also draw in that social support from the network around you, so that you're making your loss known to others, and you're providing an opportunity for other people to support you. Some things to consider as well. Do I have trouble accepting the death? So oftentimes, like, people do have some challenges with acceptance, like I mentioned earlier. These may be some of the ways that you've been impacted as well, right? So has it caused some issues with trusting others, right? Like, has trusting others been more difficult now? Am I bitter or angry about the death? So going back to think about that chart that Jenna was talking about, anger is such a common emotion in grief, but oftentimes people don't realize that until someone validates that for them. But that is a really common thing to hear from people. Am I uneasy about moving forward? Like I mentioned, that life that looks different now as you moved forward, is that something you're challenging with? Am I feeling numb or detached? Just like, again, going back to what Jenna mentioned, sometimes through different phases of a grief, sometimes we do detach from our emotions just to survive certain phases. Do I feel life is empty or meaningless? Is it hard to find that now with your loss? Do I feel like the future holds no purpose or prospects? So oftentimes I find I do a little bit of work with people on, let's look at what your life could look like now. What is your new normal? What does the future have for you now without this person that you love so much? Do I feel agitated or on edge? Grief is so exhausting, can really do a number on our mental health and how we, tolerate feelings and experiences in life. Am I avoiding or denying my grief? Sometimes people have to literally carve out time to grieve. because their life is so busy or because they're avoiding it so much. Sometimes people need to take time, to be alone and have your space, to look through the photo album, to listen to the music, to do whatever the things are to allow that pain to be felt and to be moved through you. Are others avoiding or denying my grief? Thinking about who's around you and who's helping and who's not, maybe making healthy choices for yourself around that. And hopefully after attending this presentation today, you could think a little bit about if there's anything about your grieving process that you want to change, maybe something that, has become clearer to you. So I'm just going to bring this back as well, a little bit to accessing mental health services in your own areas. Oftentimes, that counseling is something that people need. Not everyone needs counseling, and if you don't, it's okay. But if you do need it, that's also okay. There are mental health services offered through all of the zones, and there'll be some information, I'm sure, provided about that as well. But that is something, mental health services and counseling through that department is something that everyone can access just using, your MCP. It is a free service available. So I am going to stop my share now, and I assume that I'm passing it back to you, Catherine.
Yes, you are. Thank you so much. Just
Thank
going to go
you.
ahead and reshare my screen. Everybody should see my screen there now. This is some of the resources that are across Newfoundland and Labrador with regards to getting supports and information for grief and bereavement. This information is also located on our website and in our grief and bereavement brochure itself. I would like to go ahead and open up the mics and ask our audience if anybody has any questions for our guest speakers. Nobody has any questions that they would like to go ahead and ask?
I did notice there was a question in the chat, and so it might be helpful to kind of jump off that question and talk about the different ways to find support in our zones. So the question is, will you and your colleagues continue to support education, provide counseling for grief and bereavement services in the Eastern Zone? And will there be other professionals hired to work in locations outside of St. John's? So here's the tricky thing, is that services can be available in each of your zones, but they do look slightly different. And so because we're used to operating as 4 different regional health authorities, we are still very much operating that way. Grief and bereavement services is not something that it exists in Eastern Zone in one way. We're still very much zone specific at this point during the transition. So the way you access services in the Eastern Zone is a little different than the other zones. So I can kind of speak to the Eastern Zone and then pass it over to my colleagues. What we will say is that the easiest thing to remember in accessing any service across the province is to call 811. They are a provincial line. They will help you navigate the healthcare system in your zone. The work that we do is often not, we're not a crisis line. If you call grief and bereavement services in the Eastern Zone, again, we're not a crisis line, we're a counseling service. We often have some wait lists that we have to attend to, but we do offer education sessions like the one that we did today. We offer those monthly. We do have individual counseling services. Right now, there's about a 4 to 6 wait list to see an individual counselor. So what we do recommend is to use the doorways service. Again, if you are in crisis, 811. If you need to speak to a mental health professional, doorways, which is on your screen here, is a really good bridge service while you're waiting to get referred to a more specialized service. We also offer support groups. So in the Eastern Zone, Eastern Urban has 2 in-person support groups, and we also offer a virtual support group. Our priority or our mandate for the Eastern Zone is to, especially for the virtual, is to have a priority for those in the Eastern region, but we do accept people, if we can't get a full group, we do accept people from other zones. So that's Eastern Zone in a nutshell. I am the manager for grief and bereavement services in the Eastern Zone. So if you are in that zone, certainly feel free to connect with me and I can point you in the right direction. So I'll pass it off to one of my colleagues in the other zones.
Here that we have on the slide, and I'll go next. Can you hear me? Because I just took off my headset.
Yes, we can hear you, but you're a little low. If you can speak up a little bit, that'd be great.
Okay. So, again, like things look different in the zones, not just because, and I think that I'll probably be speaking to the most recent question in the chat as I speak to the central zone. I'll try to address that as well. As Jenna mentioned, 811 counseling services, that is the same for the central zone and what people would access. The difference in the central zone is we don't have bereavement services as a service that you can refer to or be referred to for counseling. I'm a grief and bereavement coordinator. I try to help people access services. I try to help educate and improve services, but I don't offer services one-on-one.
I have gone to several.
Sorry, it's hard to hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
No.
No, you still need. Oh, can you try again?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. I have a new laptop because the last one, the microphone never seemed to work right, and I still have the same issue, so I can't answer why. Sorry, what I was speaking to is the fact that, in Central, we don't have bereavement services the same way that it is in the Eastern Zone. Our structure and how we provide services looks very different. And that's regardless of the merger with the zones to NL Health Services. That's just the way things are. And so in our zone, we definitely encourage people to go to mental health and addictions, call 811 or access doorways to get counseling services. Because I'm a coordinator and I don't provide one-on-one services. And I don't have a team of bereavement counselors that I can refer to as well. So it's mental health and addiction services for that. We do offer groups occasionally. For example, right now we are recruiting for a group that will be offered once we get a suitable number of participants. We do have information groups at times, and we have like groups such as the one where we will talk about grief and the holidays. Again, because I'm kind of a standalone one-man band for grief and bereavement in Central, we don't offer it on a schedule or in the organized fashion that it's offered in Eastern Zone because my time is split between many different program areas. So hopefully that answers the question. And someone just asked about how things will function and look now as the zones are merged. We really can't answer that question, and that's why we're just kind of clarifying what we do offer right now, because nothing has really changed in that way. I'll pass it.
In Western Zone, it's similar to in Central with Shannon. So I'm a one-man band here. So I don't provide individual, but my office is more of a connecting point. So it is advertised through the internet, and our intranet at Western Zone, that I can help connect people with the service that they might need. So I do know the ins and outs of all of that, to help connect people with the right resource in Western Zone. But we do offer a bereavement group, so that's an 8-week group, and we vary it depending on the need. It may be an in-person, and we started last year an online as well. So that's sort of how it works here. I help connect people, but we do offer a group as well.
Can you hear me okay? Because I have a new computer as well.
Is this Vanessa?
Yeah.
Yes,
Sorry.
Vanessa, we hear you loud and clear.
In Labrador Grenfell Health is much the same as in Central and Western. We don't have a dedicated bereavement team, so I'm more of a connecting point if anybody needed me to connect it with services. We utilize through mental health and addictions, and would encourage doorways and 811 as well. But if people were not familiar with going that route, they needed to be connected, I could help with that. And some of our areas, depending on the numbers and the need, have offered support groups in the past, and it is something that mental health and addictions would offer if they had enough applicants to go with a support group.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We actually have a couple of hands raised there. Judy, I know you had your hand raised first there. If you could just unmute yourself there and ask your question to our guest speakers, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you.
For the presentation. I've really enjoyed it. However, I am one of those people that attends these sessions I'm grieving for a different reason. I'm grieving the loss of my health. I've been diagnosed with a disease that is going to kill me, and it's gradually getting worse. And I was just wondering if you had any groups for somebody in my situation. Thank you.
Judy, can I ask what zone you're located in?
Eastern.
Okay, so again, here's a complicated piece. Grief and bereavement services in other zones is often closely linked to palliative care services, but in the Eastern zone, we have a separate department. So I can, if you wanted to reach out to me, I can connect you with the social worker at Palliative Care Services. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. She helps people with the grieving process who may experience a life-altering diagnosis. I'm not sure if there is a support group for that. I do know there used to exist a support group for folks who had rapid onset cancer diagnosis. But again, that's a very specific group. But yeah, Judy, you send me an email and I'll try to get you connected with the right person that might be able to answer your question.
Because recently when I saw the doctor, I asked him to refer me to PCU. And he did tell me, oh no, it's too soon. But to me, he was treating my disease. He's not treating me.
If you were diagnosed, it's not too soon.
Sorry?
If you were diagnosed, it's not too soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too soon.
That's a common. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Anyway, I just felt like he was treating my disease, not treating me.
That's right.
Judy, Jenna's email is here on the left-hand side of the screen, grief and bereavement at easternhealth.ca.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add one comment because I say all the time, and I'll say it again, but I wear a lot of different hats in my role. And one of the hats that I wear is both, providing, person to person palliative care counseling to people such as you, Judy, who do have a diagnosis that is terminal. But I also spend a lot of time educating individuals about palliative care. And that's just a moment where, you're absolutely right. And you may not need to be referred to a palliative care unit where you need to be admitted anywhere, but starting palliative care early is when we really see the best benefit and the best outcomes. And it really helps people a lot with their coping and how they manage that. So I'm sure that connection will get made. And, you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy. Jane, I know you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, please?
Yes, I'm from Western Zone, and I'm a priest in Port Bath, actually. I'm wondering, is there any information, because I come across a lot of people who's seeking grief counseling, but it's for themselves, but in discussion, we've come across the fact that I think they're more concerned with the loved one that's left behind, and they can't move forward in their grief because they're trying to, let's say a wife died and the father is there, and maybe the daughter and grandson is so involved in trying to help the person whose loved one has passed, in a sense, they can't grieve. I would love to have some pamphlets or something to be able to pass along to them. I've already met with people like that, and I said I would try to get some information so that they can grieve in their way as well as helping their loved one in their way. Am I making sense?
Yes.
So how to support a loved one who is grieving?
Yeah, like for instance, let's say the wife died and the father is left behind, and the father is so deep in his grief that those children or grandchildren that's trying to comfort the father don't really know how to grieve themselves because they're trying to be everything to this person, and they're not getting their needs out, and they're feeling guilty and they're feeling bad, and like there's a lot of things going on, but there's not much information out around. Even for me, I can go through it from experience and I know what they're saying, but I would like to have some pamphlets or something. And Sandra, this is for that I know it's you, but if there's anything on the go, if you could just send it out to Western Health and Port Bath, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm not sure, I guess, how to answer at the moment, but I can definitely research and get some things. I'm sure I have some things in my office and online that I can share with you.
So Sandra, would you like Jane to reach out to you after the meeting just so she could provide you with her contact information?
I know Jane, I have her contact information.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
She's one of the clergy in my area that I work with. So yeah, I'll reach out to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anybody else has a question that they would like to ask. However, I do have some question that I would like to read out that was asked during registration. What are the steps to become a volunteer with the palliative care program? So it doesn't actually say what zone this person lives in, but is there opportunities in each one of your zones to be a volunteer with the palliative care program?
So I'll speak for Western Zone. We actually started with our first volunteer a couple of weeks ago, so it's a bit of a new area for us. And so we're just easing into it a little bit. So our first volunteer is actually going to come and bake on our floor. We have a beautiful kitchen and family area. So she's going to bake and then share some of those items with the patients and their families. And we are then going to expand volunteer opportunities. So if the question is someone from Western, you can definitely connect with me and we can try and see how we can fit in if you have some interest in that area.
Thank you. One of the other ladies?
I'll speak to Eastern Zone because I have to duck out now quickly to another presentation. But Eastern Zone has a volunteer services webpage, actually. So if you go on Eastern it's still the Eastern Health website, and go under volunteer services. There's an application there. So on your application, you can put that you would like to volunteer with the palliative care unit, and they do have their own folks at the Miller Centers where the palliative care unit is located, where they will do an interview with you, check your references, make sure you get set up, and do the training with you to become a volunteer. But you just have to make it clear on your application that that's the location that you're looking to volunteer with.
That would be the case for all the zones, actually. They would all have volunteer resources. So I'm just sort of speaking to palliative here because that's where I work half the time, but then if we chatted, I would have referred you to volunteer resources. So that's the best route to check with.
Yes, and I won't reiterate what my colleagues have said, because it will be the same for Central. You would, just go through the regular volunteer program, and you would make a note that that's an area that you want to do some specific work in.
And yeah, same for LG Health as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I do have another question here, and I hope this individual is on our call, because we may need to have some additional information from you in order to answer it. The question is, how much should a person become involved in the grieving process? So by me reading that, it would be somebody that is actually, say, supporting a family member or a friend who is actually going through the grieving process. So I'm not sure if you're on the line or on our call. If you've asked that question, would you be able to come off, unmute yourself, and just elaborate on the support or the question answers that you're looking for?
And if you're not comfortable with that, you could also type it in the chat.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. In the meantime, would you guys like to try to answer that on how much should somebody become involved in the grieving process?
For sure. And so, I think that for first and foremost, that really is individual, how much you can support someone. We all have to have boundaries about, what we can or can't offer people in our daily lives. So it would really depend on, how much you have the ability to cope with that. And it's very individual in terms of how much you can provide for support for someone. Don't underestimate the day-to-day things that can be very valuable in support. So more and more in the literature, in grief work, we constantly see that it's the informal supports and networks that can be very valuable to people. So, having a tea with someone, going for a walk with them, calling them for a chat, that's a really valuable form of support. It doesn't you don't have to provide the answers to all the questions, to be a support to somebody. So I hope that gives some insight into what it is that you're asking about, and I would just open it up to my colleagues if they would add anything to that, or if there's an individual on who would like to speak to that.
Okay, everybody seems to be a little bit silent. Anybody else have any other questions that they would like to ask our guest speakers?
I'd like to say something. Talking what you just said about giving people a call. My brother died 3 years ago, and his wife, both of us are still so grieving. But when I reached out to her a lot of times and I chatted with her a half an hour, she often said to me, "Thank you for calling, Barb. I really appreciate it. You calling and we talking about it. I feel much better now tonight than I did before you called." So calling somebody and just chatting for half an hour means a whole lot. It meant a whole lot to me for two of us to talk about my brother. I just wanted to reach out and tell people that this does work. A phone call is not too far away to make somebody happy in the moment.
That's absolutely true, Barb, and appreciate your comment there. That I think majority of us on this call have actually gone through, we've all gone through grief, and when you do have somebody that reaches out to you just to say hello, that they're thinking of you, it does mean the world. I have to say.
Yeah. That's, like I mentioned, that informal support. Not everyone
Yeah.
needs specialized grief counseling. Having someone to talk to, and you don't have, and if you're the person on the other end of the phone, you don't have to have the answers. You don't
No.
have to. You don't have to offer big, grandiose ideas about how to make anything better. Just listening is really helpful.
Absolutely. I'm just going to go ahead and change my screen over here for a moment. And for those in the Western Zone, will be a grief and bereavement in-person and online support group on November the 21st. And of course, to register for this session, please call Sandra. I don't know, Sandra, if you would like to add anything or say anything to our audience, maybe that's on from the West Coast.
I think that Sandra just had to step out, she said.
I just
Oh no,
came
she's
back,
there.
so
She's there.
She's there.
I just got back, so I don't know what you said about the group, but it's starting in November.
Yeah.
And you can email me at spiritualhealth.westernhealth.nl.ca or give me a call and we can get you registered. But currently it is only for those that live in the Western Zone, just so that we can manage numbers. So it's only for our zone.
Thank you very much. And when there are sessions available for the grief and bereavement support groups with the other zones, you can be sure that I will be sending those out widely for the areas. Anybody else have any questions or comments that they would like to add?
Sandra, will you be just sending us the email so we could just register, or do I have to call in and check?
I'll send it out as a reminder, but it is for people who have experienced the loss of the loved one. It's not for people who want to learn to support others. It's
I'll just mention it to a couple of people that may be interested. Okay. And I'll check it out. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would actually, a huge thank you goes out to Jenna, Vanessa, Sandra, and Shannon for taking the time today to talk about grief and bereavement. I mean, for me personally, it was an eye-opener, especially with the factors of grief, to actually realize a lot of what I have been experiencing. It's not just me. It's there. It's everybody is experiencing. It was, again, a real eye-opener for me, along with the different types of supports that are out there, the support groups. So I appreciate and thank each and every one of you for everything that you do. We do have, before I talk about our next sessions, there's a comment in the chat, and I just want to go back to that one. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat that my colleague's going to have a look at. No, I think we're okay. I just want to make sure we're not overlooking a question there. Our next session, Let's Talk About, session will be on November the 1st, and this is Common Law Rights. And on November the 15th, we are going to be holding a Let's Talk About on tax and disability credits. So please mark your calendars and stay tuned for the meeting invitations. And if you have any questions, if there's anything that we can help with, if you want numbers to any of the support groups that were listed on a couple of slides just beforehand, please don't hesitate to reach out to Seniors NL. We are here to help and support you. There's another comment there in the chat just before I go, and I think we're okay. Yes, we are. We're good. Thank you so much. And again, I'm going to second that. It was an extremely very helpful session. I would like to thank everybody again for joining the call. A huge thank you again to our guest speakers, and I hope everybody has a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.